If an American female spy fell into the hands of the enemy, what would happen? She would be stripped down to her underwear, her hands and feet would be tied with rope, and a big brute would force a plastic tube into her mouth, then pour cold water down her throat. If that didn't make her confess, they would stomp on her water-filled stomach. This brutal torture went on for 2 years. Eventually, the woman was rescued by the Americans through a hostage exchange. As she was leaving the bridge of no return, this woman, named Salt, was deeply puzzled. She knew that as a covert operative, once exposed, she would automatically be considered disposable, and the CIA wouldn't rescue her. Her boss, Ted, told Salt that was indeed the plan, but one man caused such a ruckus in Congress and the Senate that the CIA was forced to rescue her under pressure. That man was Salt's boyfriend. Looking at this naive and foolish man, Salt couldn't believe it. After all, she had initially targeted him as part of her mission, but unexpectedly, the man truly loved her and was willing to do anything to save her life. Salt, whose heart had been cold and unyielding, began to soften. Upon returning to the U.S., Salt married the man, and they lived a happy, peaceful life. She rejoined the CIA and became an intelligence director, forming an inseparable partnership with Ted, who had once retrieved her from North Korea. One day, as Salt and Ted were about to leave work, they were urgently called back by a colleague. Ted noticed that Peabody from counterintelligence was also present, signaling that this emergency was not a trivial matter. It turned out they had captured an old agent who defected from Russia's FSB. As an expert interrogator, Salt entered the room to question the Russian agent alone. The agent, Orlov, immediately noticed the ring on Salt's finger and shook his head mockingly. To him, marriage was the easiest way for a female spy to become distracted. In their line of work, there should be no room for love. Salt ignored Orlov's mockery and demanded to know what crucial intelligence he had. Orlov, instead, told her a story. During the Cold War, a Soviet spymaster designed a sleeper agent program. It involved training countless orphan children in a secret monastery. They were trained physically, taught English, and immersed in American culture and habits. These children were secretly sent to the U.S. in various ways, raised in American families, and became true Americans, waiting to be activated one day. Now, one of these agents was about to be activated, with the mission to assassinate the visiting Russian vice president in the U.S., sparking a conflict between the two countries. Salt thought Orlov sounded delusional, like he was spinning a wild tale. She was eager to leave and stood up to exit the interrogation room, but Orlov called her back. Orlov revealed that the agent set to be activated was Salt herself. The people watching from outside the interrogation room were stunned. Even more shocking, the polygraph indicated that Orlov was telling the truth. As Salt left the room, she noticed that everyone was looking at her differently. Her first thought was that her husband might be in danger since Orlov's first words had been about her marriage. Her husband could easily be used as leverage against her. Under Peabody's watchful eye, Salt called her husband, but there was no answer. Peabody was already starting to doubt Salt. In their line of work, no one could be trusted completely. At this point, Salt could no longer leave the CIA building. Until her innocence was proven, she was placed in a separate interrogation room. Meanwhile, Orlov was being escorted out by agents. As they entered the elevator, Orlov suddenly pulled a spring-loaded knife from his shoe and swiftly killed the two CIA agents. In the interrogation room, Salt paced back and forth, growing increasingly anxious. When she heard alarms blaring and saw Peabody and others rushing out of the room, her fear for her husband's safety escalated. Desperate to leave and find her husband, Salt asked to use the restroom as a pretext to exit the interrogation room. She hurried to the lobby, intending to pass through security and leave, but Peabody and his team had already spotted her movements on the surveillance cameras and alerted the front desk. Salt quickly turned and entered the CIA's secure passage. As she prepared to break a window to escape the building, metal security shields rose over all the windows and even stopped the elevators. It became clear that every move Salt made was being monitored on camera. Grabbing a fire extinguisher, she sprayed the security cameras to obscure their view. Then she ran into a closed interrogation room, taking off her underwear to cover the camera. Surrounded by metal walls with only one exit, Salt began to improvise a weapon. She overturned the table, unscrewed a metal table leg to use as a barrel, stuffed acid-soaked cloth into the tube, inserted the pole from a swivel chair as the projectile, and used the fire extinguisher as a propellant. A powerful homemade cannon was ready. Meanwhile, Peabody and his team had gathered outside, fully geared with riot helmets and guns. Standing at the door of the interrogation room, Peabody counted down from 3, and as the security door opened, the team was ready to rush in. but Salt fired her makeshift cannon, scattering the assault team. In the chaos, she quickly vaulted over the security door and grabbed a handgun from one of the agents. Salt ran to the stairwell and shot the 4 corners of the glass window, shattering it, and made her escape from the CIA building. Having lost her shoes during the escape, she was now barefoot. Running down the street, she flagged down a taxi and headed home, trying to call her husband again, but there was still no answer. To avoid being tracked, she took out her phone's SIM card. This experienced female spy, normally composed, was now overwhelmed with worry, her mind flashing through memories of her husband. Just as Orlov had said, her husband had become her greatest weakness. When Salt arrived home, the house was empty except for their pet dog. The dog ran to a toppled chair, and Salt immediately understood her husband had been kidnapped. Time was running out. Salt grabbed a prepared backpack from the closet, took the dog, and prepared to escape through the study. Before leaving, she also grabbed her husband's research spider. By then, the CIA team had arrived. Peabody noticed the broken window in the study. He leaned out, scanning the high-rise exterior, but couldn't find any trace of Salt. In reality, Salt was hiding behind an air conditioning unit, climbing into the neighboring apartment. Inside was a young girl. Salt entrusted the dog to her and even left money for dog food. At this moment, Salt didn't resemble a cold-hearted spy. She seemed more like a warm, caring neighbor, wearing a hat. Salt walked down the street, but her old partner, Ted, recognized her silhouette from a distance. Salt had no choice but to continue running for her life. She ran onto a bridge, only to be cornered by CIA agents from both ends. Peabody arrived, gun drawn, forcing Salt to stop and take cover behind a car. She pleaded with Peabody, saying she just wanted to find her husband and wasn't trying to flee. She insisted someone had framed her, but no one listened to her explanations. The armed agents moved in, ready to apprehend her. Seeing that her words were in vain, Salt waited for a large truck to pass beneath the bridge, then turned and jumped off the bridge. Salt landed on top of the truck, but Peabody wasn't ready to give up. He radioed for police cars to block the road ahead. Salt had no choice but to leap onto the roof of a nearby tanker truck. Peabody was still in hot pursuit, driving ahead of the tanker and positioning himself on the bridge. He raised his gun, taking aim at Salt. As she got closer and closer to being shot, Salt sprinted and, under fire, made another daring leap onto a smaller truck. Salt struggled to climb onto the truck's roof, but the truck driver, seeing a woman on top of his vehicle, panicked and slammed the brakes, throwing Salt off the truck. Peabody was on her tail again. Salt hijacked a motorcycle, weaving through traffic jams at breakneck speed. Peabody followed closely, driving up an on-ramp in pursuit. But amidst the crowded traffic, there was no way for him to keep up with Salt's nimble motorcycle. Helpless, Peabody watched as Salt sped away. In a bar restroom, Salt kicked open a metal box on the wall and pulled out sanitary pads to dress her severe wound. She then used a hood to conceal her distinctive blonde hair. When a group of women entered the restroom, Salt discreetly stole one of their coats. As a trained professional, her first priority on the run was to use whatever was available to treat her injuries and disguise herself. Salt took a bus to New York City, where she used an alias to book a luxury suite at a hotel. While walking down the hall, she helped herself to several pieces of dry-cleaned clothing. Salt then laid out her arsenal on the bed. From her room, she had a perfect view of the church where the Russian president was set to attend an event the next day. It appeared that Salt was really going to assassinate the president. The next morning, the area was heavily guarded. Peabody and Ted led a team to secure the location, determined to prevent Salt from attempting the assassination. Security was tight, with officers even stationed in the subway passing beneath the church. But Salt, now disguised, was already standing in the subway. As they approached the church station, Salt dropped a lit, smoking newspaper. The smoke drew the attention of both the passengers and the police. Salt seized the opportunity, opened the car door, and jumped onto an abandoned platform from the fast-moving subway. She made her way through the corridors and arrived below the church. After taking down the guards, she found herself directly beneath the church's main hall and threw a remote-controlled bomb toward the ceiling. Salt pressed the button, causing an explosion in the ceiling. The ground beneath the Russian president, who was giving a speech, began to crack. Suddenly, with a loud crash, the president fell into a deep pit, and the church erupted into chaos. The president landed right beside Salt amidst the swirling dust. Salt shot him. At that moment, Peabody arrived in the basement, only to find the Russian president dead. Salt was holding a gun, pointing it at him, but she didn't fire. Instead, she glanced at Peabody and smiled. She raised her hands, surrendering, and soon after, the security team arrived in the basement and arrested Salt. Salt was escorted out of the church by the police, with her former boss, Ted, furious. He angrily demanded to know why Salt did this, but she remained silent. As Peabody watched the convoy of police cars driving away, something still felt off to him. Salt had the chance to kill him in the basement, yet she didn't. As the police cars crossed a bridge, Salt's mind drifted to memories of her childhood, revealing that she had indeed been a spy trained by the Soviet Union's master spies from a young age. She had undergone plastic surgery and memorized her new identity in America from childhood. This is how she had become Salt. As these memories resurfaced, Salt suddenly took action. She grabbed a stun gun from the guard beside her and knocked out all the officers in the police car. Still in handcuffs, Salt used the stun gun to incapacitate the driver, causing the police car to crash into the bridge railing. The car smashed into vehicles below, and as the rescuers were distracted, Salt freed herself from the handcuffs and vanished into the crowd. Salt then took a boat to a remote junkyard, where Orlov was already waiting for her. It turned out that he was the former Soviet master spy who had trained Salt as an assassin. Orlov had trained a whole group of killers, and his goal was to ignite a war between the US and Russia for his political agenda. He led Salt to the bottom of a ship, where a group of his henchmen opened a door. Inside, Salt saw her husband, whom she had been worried about, held hostage by Orlov. Orlov had feared that Salt might fall in love and lose her edge, so he had kidnapped her husband to keep her loyal. Even now, Orlov was still wary. He ordered his men to open a water valve, and seawater began flooding the ship's bottom. Orlov kept his eyes fixed on Salt, while his henchmen pointed a gun at her. Any sign of disobedience, and Salt would be shot on the spot. Salt gazed blankly at her husband, who was about to drown, showing no emotion, but in reality, she was holding back. She fought to suppress the trembling of her lips and the tears welling in her eyes. She watched helplessly as the person she loved most was submerged by the sea. Orlov, now fully convinced of Salt's loyalty, began outlining her next mission. He instructed her to meet with a NATO agent, who would assign her the next task. Seeing that Orlov had nothing else to say, Salt made her move. She grabbed a glass bottle and stabbed Orlov to death before slaughtering everyone at the base. After killing them all, Salt, heartbroken, looked at her drowned husband, remembering the moments they had shared. She recalled his words about growing old together, now just an empty promise. As Orlov had said, people in their line of work were never meant to have a normal love life. Despite killing Orlov, Salt didn't stop there. She boarded a plane to meet the NATO agent. Seeing the scarred face of the bald man, Salt was reminded of her old friend Schneider, with whom she had trained in the monastery. Schneider was now the NATO and White House liaison, and tonight he would escort Salt into the White House. Salt's next mission: assassinate the President of the United States. That evening, Schneider and his female assistant passed through the heavily guarded checkpoints of the White House, eventually meeting the president. The female assistant had no idea what Schneider's real mission was, and the next second, he suddenly shoved her aside. He grabbed a grenade and, under a hail of bullets, charged at the president. The president was immediately taken into the underground bunker by his bodyguards. Ted, who had been beside the president the whole time, seemed to recognize a familiar face. He had a hunch that Salt was somewhere inside the White House. The female assistant rushed to an empty room and tore off her heavy mask. Ted's suspicions were confirmed. The assistant was Salt. Salt knocked out the guards at the elevator doors and pried them open, spotting the elevator with the president inside as it descended. Salt quickly jumped between the walls, trying to catch up to the moving elevator. By the time the president and his team reached the bottom and entered the bunker, Salt was right on their heels. Just as the heavy iron door was about to close, Salt slipped in. The president reached the bunker's command center and placed the black briefcase he carried onto the table. Inside the briefcase was the U.S. nuclear launch button, a critical device the president carried during emergencies. At that moment, staffers realized Salt had already breached the bunker. To ensure the president's safety, the security chief sealed the entire command room. Since Salt was a Russian spy, the president decided to initiate a nuclear deterrence against Russia. He contacted the Secretary of Defense, and the two of them entered the launch codes. After verification, the president was granted control of the nuclear launch button. He could now launch the nukes at any moment. Meanwhile, outside the command room, Salt had killed all the guards. The security chief prepared to grab his gun and head out to stop Salt, but to his surprise, Ted, who was also in the command room, suddenly turned on everyone. He shot and killed everyone in the room, except for the president. It turned out Ted had been a Soviet sleeper agent all along. The real ace up Orlov's sleeve. Ted shot the president and took control of the black briefcase. At this moment, Salt arrived outside the command room. At that moment, he realized that his longtime CIA colleague, whom he had worked with for years, was just like him, a fellow agent of the same origin. Ted had locked in the launch coordinates for the nuclear missile, targeting Tehran, the capital of Iran. Through the bulletproof glass, Ted revealed to Salt the real objective of the mission: to use America's nuclear weapons to kill 9 million Muslims. This act would plunge the US into endless war. Salt, determined to prevent this man-made catastrophe, pretended to agree with Ted, speaking softly as though she wanted to join him in completing this glorious mission. In truth, Ted had fallen for Salt the moment he first saw her, but at that time, Salt's heart belonged to someone else, so Ted had kept his love hidden all these years. Just as he was about to let Salt into the room, he saw a news broadcast on TV. The Russian president was standing alive before the public. He wasn't dead after all. The news report explained that the president had been poisoned by a spider toxin, which had only put him in a state of false death. Now, he had fully recovered. Ted immediately realized that this was all Salt's doing. He now understood that Salt had broken away from their organization long ago. She had truly fallen in love with the man who had saved her. Ted then revealed to Salt that it was he who had orchestrated her husband's death. He was the one who had ordered Salt's husband to be kidnapped. The truth was finally out. Enraged, Salt fired her gun at the glass window, but the sealed meeting room was as impenetrable as a fortress. Even machine gun fire was useless. Salt quickly moved to the meeting room's door and relentlessly shot at the wall beside it, where the room's control panel was located. Finally, the cement wall crumbled, creating a small hole. Salt pulled out the control chip, opened the door, and stormed into the room, engaging Ted in a fierce gunfight. After both ran out of bullets, they resorted to hand-to-hand combat. Meanwhile, the large screen displayed that the nuclear launch process had been 100% completed. All it took was the press of a button, and the world would be engulfed in war. Salt managed to knock Ted down, and at that moment, soldiers burst into the room. Salt rushed to the control panel and yanked out the data cables for the nuclear missile. In the process, she was shot in the chest by a soldier. Salt fell to the ground, watching as the screen showed that the system had been shut down. Ted resumed his role as the CIA director, successfully deceiving everyone present. Salt, though shot, survived because she was wearing a bulletproof vest. Peabody arrived with his team. Ted knew that the only way to keep himself safe from exposure was to eliminate Salt. He took out a pair of scissors and pretended to sit casually in the hallway, waiting for Salt. Salt knew exactly what he was planning. As they passed each other, she struck first. Salt strangled Ted to death with her bare hands. Peabody then escorted Salt onto a helicopter, heading to the CIA headquarters at Langley for interrogation. On the helicopter, Peabody couldn't understand why Salt had killed Ted, someone he had been close to. Salt explained everything to Peabody, but he remained skeptical. However, Salt questioned Peabody, asking if she really wanted to kill the Russian president. Wouldn't she have done so? And why didn't she kill Peabody when she had the chance? Just then, Peabody received a message. His team had found Salt's fingerprints on Orlov's corpse. At that moment, Peabody had no choice but to believe Salt's story was true. Salt revealed that agents like her were still hidden all over America. She was only the tip of the iceberg. Salt then made a deal with Peabody. She asked him to let her go, and in return, she would take care of the remaining sleeper agents. Peabody, being a smart man, pretended to punch Salt hard, but in reality, he secretly unlocked her handcuffs. Suddenly, Salt opened the helicopter door and jumped into the lake below, disappearing into the water. Salt ran through the forest, determined to finish what she had started. I'm a movie enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.